This week saw the 20-year anniversary of Return of the King, but I'm going to cheat and focus on the two towers in this video and some of my favourite characters in the movies. Now, not Treebeard in this video, that might come in the future though, but this chap here, probably my favourite character in the whole series, and it gives me the opportunity to say Merry Christmas. Welcome to Miniature Realms, my name's Stuart, and in this video I'm going to show you how I painted Merry from the Treebeard set. So I started by priming the miniature black, which tends to be my go-to for most miniatures these days. Moving swiftly onto an underpainting stage using bold titanium white through the airbrush. This is more than a zenithal. I cover most of the miniature of this, leaving a little bit of shadow in the deepest recesses. Finishing off with a dry brush of white on the top, just really picking out some of those extra details. This leaves me with this really nice grayscale style miniature that's really picked out all the detail, but it's got enough brightness there to really take some base coats using some glazes. So I'm going to start here with the skin and Vallejo Express Color Dwarf Skin or Dwarf Skin. And it works just like a contrast paint or Army Painter speed paint, and I love to use these paints for my base coats, and that's why I've prepared the miniature in this way with this underpainting style. If you watch a lot of my videos, you'll have heard this a lot of times before. And what I'm going to do with this video that is slightly different to many of my others is paint more how I would if I was painting for myself rather than just for the video. So rather than doing a jump off point in the middle when all the base layers are done and I say, right, this is where you could stop and it's perfectly gameable, I'm going to work on each stage at a time to completion. So I'm going to work through the skin here, doing all the highlights, doing the eyes before I move on to the next colour. What I'm trying to achieve here is a fairly high standard tabletop finish for a character or something like that, and I'm going to take about 3 or 4 hours on this miniature. So we're not talking about competition painting, but we are talking about a much more than the rank and file. I wanted to give you a little bit more of an idea of how I go about painting. I'm trying to keep my palette on the screen for you, so when I mix paints later on in the video you can see the way I work and just give you a little bit more of an idea of what's going on off camera when I'm painting on these videos. And for those of you who are looking to maybe push those skills on from that sort of very basic contrast with basic highlights on top, you can see how I wet blend a little bit, how I layer and how I mix my paints on the palette. Now I really love this skin colour. It does a fantastic job of giving a really nice smooth flat finish all over and really settles in those recesses. So you get this fantastic effect already that looks like you've already highlighted a miniature, and I know that's the point with these style of paints, but some of them do it better than others, and the underpainting stage in this, the zenithal, heavy zenithal with the dry brushing over the top, the grayscale really gives you that kind of subtle highlight and shadow already built into the miniature. So when you do a nice even coat with a little bit extra to pull in the recesses, you get a super nice finish, and that's what I'm trying to achieve here. So now we add in Gloomy Violet and Deep Purple, both from the Vallejo Express Color range. This is my favourite skin method at the moment. I'm sure it will change in the future as I discover new paints or new methods and things, but this is my go-to at the moment. I really enjoy using it, and I stole it from Jan Hidalgo's YouTube channel as well, so it's nothing I've come up with. When he was testing these paints for Vallejo, this was one of the methods he used in one of his demonstration videos. So we got the Gloomy Violet first, and I'm using that in the recesses. That's the colder colour, using that in the shadows around the nape of the neck there, around the wrists where the wrists are hidden by the fabric that's folding over them, that kind of thing, around the top of the brow, maybe around where the skin meets the edge of the hairline, that kind of thing. Now the Deep Purple, this is a warmer colour, so I focus this on other areas of the face, so around the lips and the cheeks and the nose, trying to leave it off the flat surfaces at the top, especially at the bridge of the nose and things like that, but getting it into the recesses around the eyes, around the sides of the nose, and definitely over those sort of cheek areas. I also like to use it on the tops of the hands, around the knuckles. Now I have thinned both of these paints, probably 2 parts paint to 1 part water, and I'm putting them very sparingly, so very thin, almost glazes in the areas that I want to, only going back and adding extra into the recesses where I feel that it's needed. To highlight the skin, I'm going to be using 3 colours from the Noctura range. So we have Natural Flesh, we have Fairy Flesh, and then for the top highlight, which I'll use very little of, we have White Flesh. Now the Noctura range is a set of paints by Vallejo. So they will cover those paints in their other ranges, or very close to it. Well, I know sometimes it can be hard to get hold of, and I've only ever found them as sets. I'm sure there's independent retailers that maybe will sell them on their own off the shelf, but I've always bought them as sets. Now this darker colour here I find is almost the perfect natural highlight to that dwarf skin base colour there from the Vallejo Express colour. And again, very little paint. I'm just slowly building it on. They're all thin, as you can see on my palette. There's probably a little bit too much paint that I'll need there, but at least you could see it easier on the camera. There's water on there as well, and I thin them out, and I'm just slowly adding it to the top areas where the light would hit, and then blending it out, trying not to obliterate the paint that I've already put on there. So using the same method on the knuckles as well, just taking my time, making sure that I leave some of those darker colours underneath, just focusing on the areas of detail on the model, the raised bits, so it does the work for you. And then following that on to the feet and the ankles as well. You'll notice there I'm mixing on the palette, so I'm blending the two colours next to each other together, so you've got a transition between the two that's even softer. And again, very thin layers, focusing on the nose, the bridge there, and on the tops of the cheekbones where the light would catch. At this point I'm adding the whites to the eyes before I finish the highlights on the face, so if I do make any mistakes with the eyes I can go back and fix them without messing up all the nice highlighting I've done on the face already. Give that a few seconds to dry and just dot in the pupils as well with a bit of black. With that done, I'm adding another Natura paint to the range, and I'm using a little bit of reddish flesh here. I'm just wanting to add a little bit of warmth underneath the eyes and add a little bit of extra shadow after I put those eyes in. And if you had made a mistake and made one eye a slightly different shape to the other, you can use this to tidy up. So just thin lines just underneath the eyes there. And then I'm back to the previous highlight colours as well, just slowly getting lighter and lighter, moving up that small sort of spectrum of colour there and really focusing on those higher areas. By keeping the paint fairly thin, I'm not building up these really stark contrasts here. And then if I find I've gone a little bit too dark, and just get a little bit more of that reddish brown and just blend it in while the paint's still wet around the edge of the nose, so you've got that warmth in there as well. Once I finished those highlights, I thought that the skin just around the mouth looked a little bit too washed out, so again I went back to my gloomy violet there, thinned a little bit more and just added a little bit of that reddish colour back, which really just kind of gave him a little bit more warmth and variance to the face. I'm using a mixture of contrast Cygor brown here, and also a mix of Vallejo Express colour deep purple. I've mixed these together 50-50, and I found they gave the nice kind of brownish purple mix that I needed for the trousers. I couldn't find anything in my colours that would match it on its own. None of the purples were quite right, none of them had quite the right tone, so I don't mind mixing colours, especially if it's for one-off miniatures like this. It becomes a bit more of a pain if you're doing a whole army or something and you've got to remember the exact mixes. But this just gave a really nice base layer. I could have maybe just used a flat colour here as well, it would work just as well, but I do like working over these underpainted miniatures, which if you've watched my videos before, you know how much I enjoy it. I'm going to be using a few colours to highlight those trousers. We got whole red, got saddle brown, these are all from Vallejo model colour. We got German pale brown, and then we've got a little bit of deck tan as well to help mix in for that top. We start with those four colours all on the wet palette. You see there's far too much of the one there, it's shot out of the bottle, and I just work my way along, blending the colours one into the next, and then just adding a highlight, just like we saw with the face. Taking my time, making sure the paints are thin, add a little bit of water as well that's in the wet palette itself. And we're making sure that we leave the darkest colour that was already there in the recesses. We're not obliterating that base layer. We're just adding thin lines and slowly blending it out where necessary. And when we get towards the top highlights, those lines get a little bit thinner, and we can do some very fine, faint top highlights at the end. As we work down that small spectrum of colours, you can see the highlights start to build up, and you get this multi-layer effect on the trousers. And it's all very easy, keeping the paint nice and wet and thin. You don't make too many mistakes, and if you do, you've got all four colours there on the palette, so you can always go back with a darker colour and fill in where you think you've gone a little bit too light. As we get to the lighter colours, you really see it start to pop. You can see me here going back in with one of the darker colours just to thin out one of those highlight lines that I thought was a little bit too thick. But as we get to this final layer and we get to that sort of final top highlight where the deck tan is mixed in, you can just see that the trousers start to pop, and those focusing on those creases in the trousers and then the highlighted areas, and I think they look pretty cool. If you're enjoying this video, please consider giving us a like or dropping a comment below. It really helps the video be seen by other people. And if you'd like to support further, you can always join the Patreon. There are 5 different tiers at the moment. The top tiers have tuition, where I could teach you one-on-one over the interwebs using the wonders of Zoom and things like that, how to paint like I am in the video here. If you just want to support in another way, the bottom tiers start at $1 or £1 now as well. So back to the miniature and onto Nasdrag Yellow, a contrast paint, and I'm only using this for a short period, so I'm going to cheat and do this straight from the pot. So I'm still taking my time here and trying not to create too much pooling. I want there to be a little bit of pooling in those recesses, giving us that natural shadow, but I don't want pooling on the flat areas. And all I'm using it on here is his waistcoat. And what you'll notice I do after I put this first layer on is I just, with a clean brush, I'll just take a little bit off the center of those flat areas, which already builds in some highlight. To highlight the waistcoat, I'm going to be using base Avalanche Sunset and Phalanx Yellow. These are both Citadel paints, and I've popped them on my palette. I've also added a bit of Vallejo Off-White as well. I start by adding the base layer, just like I did with the skin and on the trousers, and then blending them together and slowly working the way up to the top highlights. So focusing to start with on the centers panel of the waistcoat, so I'm not destroying any of that shadow that's built into the recesses. Then I start focusing on the areas where the light would hit the most, or there are the edges of something. So we have those folds in the fabric that are a little bit higher, so I've put some highlights on those. But I also like to put that lighter color around the edge of the fabric, so we're talking about the bottom of the waistcoat and around the one side that's folded over the top of the other. It just really helps it stand out and really contrast against the darkest areas. Adding a little bit of white to that final mix to really make those top parts really pop. Now we're back to Vallejo Express Color Lizard Green. Now if you haven't used these paints, they really are very good. I'm looking forward to picking up some of the expanded range when it's out. This is a perfect base green for his jacket underneath. It's very, very bright and vibrant, probably a little bit brighter than the colors from the jacket in the movie. I've got a little bit more cartoon on the paint job here. I want it to stand out and be quite bright rather than be too desaturated. I quite like that look for my Lord of the Rings miniatures. And once that base layer is down, we need to highlight it, and I'm looking at layer Warpstone Glow from Citadel, and then we have Deck Tan again from Model Color. Just like before, I have both colours on the wet palette, so I can mix them there on the palette as I go, starting with the darker colour first, focusing on those higher areas, so on the folds of the fabric where they reach their highest points, and around the edges, just like I did with the trousers and the waistcoat. So as we move along, I'm slowly adding more and more of the Deck Tan to the mix and just focusing on the same areas, making those highlight lines thinner and thinner as we go, and you can see the layers start to build up. As we get to those topmost highlights, it might almost be pure white or pure Deck Tan in this case. I just end up putting little dots on corners and things and little marks, and it really makes a difference and seems to make it stand out. For the cloak, I'm going to be using a mix of contrast paints. We've got Pterodon Turquoise, got Griff Charger Grey, and we got Basilicanium Grey, and I've done an equal mix of all 3. Now this looks a bit odd when it goes on, but the overall effect afterwards is exactly what you need. So as you see here, it looks a little bit odd, settles nicely into the recesses, but doesn't stain the top colour much at all. So I'm making sure that I cover over all of the areas of the cloak, making sure it doesn't pull too much, manipulating those kind of pooling areas with my brush to try and even them out, taking my time to do that. And you've got your time to do that with contrast. It's fairly quick drying, but it's not like a Nuln Oil or something like that where you pull straight away. So you've got a little bit of time to work on it. As it starts to dry, you can see where I've removed all of those big pooling areas, and I'm just adding little bits back where I don't think there's enough shadow built in. I've gone back and given a slightly thinner second glaze layer over some parts of it, and making sure that I've not got any areas where there isn't a nice balance between shadow and light. Now we're going to highlight this slightly differently, but we've got bronze green going on the palette from Model Color. We have Model Air Pale Blue, and then we also have a little bit of Deck Tan as well. So I'm working from the lightest colour first, which is reverse to all the others. I quite like the colour of the cloak as it is, but what you need to do is tidy it up and refine it and move the eye to look towards the highlighted areas, because right now it looks a little bit like a wash has gone on it. It doesn't look like the same effect you normally get from a contrast paint. But as you see, when we add the highlights here, you get a really pleasing, quite striking effect. That is one of those where you need to trust the process. So I'm starting here with almost pure deck tan, focusing on almost line highlighting, so on the most raised areas along the bottom of the cloak, and just slowly taking my time building it up with neat tidy lines, making sure they all go in the same direction in a certain area so it doesn't look too messy. You can see here the effect is starting to take shape, and I'm just really taking my time trying to be super neat and keep those lines in the neat same direction. And we ended up with this really nice sort of bluish greyish effect. And if you know your lore, you'll know that these cloaks were given by the elves to all of the fellowship, and they have this sort of magical ability that makes the wearer quite hard to see no matter what the environment they're in. So I want them to be a slightly unusual colour, not just to look like a grey woolen cloak. I'm pretty pleased with the effect as it is so far. We're almost there. Those darker colours on the palette were really just there. If I needed to darken something back up again because I felt I went a little bit too bright with the highlight, I could do that. Whereas normally when I put 3 colours on a palette, or 4 colours or something like that, I tend to work from the darkest colour up. That is the biggest difference here, as I'm working from that lightest colour down and using those darkest colours to blend back in if I feel I needed to. Now, to help that tidying up and blending down, I'm going back to Griff Charger Grey contrast, which is one of those 3 colours I use for the base layer. And I'm just building up some glazes, using it straight out the pot. This isn't one of the thickest contrast paints. I'm focusing in the shadow areas most, and then I'm just glazing out towards the lighter areas. And you'll find that it just takes away some of those brush marks, smooths it out a little bit, and provides a greater contrast, you can excuse the pun, between light and dark. For Mary's hair, I'm going to be using Wasteland Brown from Vallejo Express Colour for the base of it. It's quite a dirty blonde with reddish tints in the film, and this colour seemed to be the best mix for it. It's quite desaturated. I could have gone something like mesbg yellow, which is the same as the waistcoat, but that's just got that little bit of brightness to it, which would not only would match the waistcoat and not stand out enough, but probably be a little bit too bright for the miniature. So I really like the effect this has, and it's almost done if you want to, straight on top of that underpainted miniature. If you are following along at home, don't forget the hair on the top of the Hobbit's feet as well. Now for the highlights, I'm using model colour green ochre, and then just to lighten it, I'm using some deck tan again as a highlight option. It's really good as an option to mix into colours other than white if you don't want them too bright. And both of these are quite desaturated colours. Hair is natural and not too bright when it's a natural colour. I didn't want it to sort of pop too much, but I also still wanted the colours to be vibrant enough overall. And this really is just a matter of taking your time, working your way around a miniature, highlighting the individual strands of hair that are modelled on the miniature. Again, as you've seen before, I've blended the colours together on the wet palette so we can get lighter and lighter as we work our way around. Now turning to some contrast skeleton horde, and I've put this directly on the wet palette just because I want to thin it nicely and turn it into a glaze. And you can see here I'm just applying it all over the hair, and it just sort of ties it in a little bit, reinforces those shadows by going into the recesses, but tones down the highlights as well. I find that it just gives a nicer overall balance to the finish. For the elven brooch that's clasping his cloak, I'm using Troll Green. This is also from Vallejo Express Colour. It's just a slightly brighter green to the jacket. I want it to stand out, and I've just painted in directly there. As it's such a small area, while that's drying, I'm moving on to the stone in his hand as well. And I'm going to use Black Lotus as the base. This is also from Express Colour. It's got quite a bluish tone to it, which will give us quite a cartoon-esque looking rock. But again, that's the kind of style we're going for with this paint job. To highlight the rock, we're going to be using some AK Dunkelgrau dark base, and then just for the top highlight as well, we've got some off-white, which of course I'll mix on the palette like I've done before. So we're building it up in layers, building thin lines up on the edges that are modelled onto the rock itself, and just building up to almost pure white for those most top marks. Now that the brooch is dry, we're going to game air silver. So that brooch, if I remember rightly from the film, was a mixture of green but also jewel type, so silverish to it. So rather than highlighting the green, I'm actually just going around the edges of the shape in a pure silver paint, and I think it has just a nice little effect there that gives you the idea of what it was like in the film. Now turning to decayed metal from scale 75 metals range and just dotting that on the buttons on Mary's waistcoat. And rather than using a lighter gold colour, which will kind of get lost a little bit in that yellow waistcoat, I'm just using small dots of that same game air silver on top of that darker decayed metal just to highlight those buttons. So now it's time to get that base finished, and I'm just adding some Agrax Earth Shade to the dark earth basing texture, which you'll have noticed on camera just seemed to appear on the miniature from one take to the next, and that's because I applied it while I was waiting for another coat to dry. It's something that takes a while as it is anyway, so it just speeds up the process slightly. And once that's dry, I just rub in a few dry pigments, blowing the excess off afterwards. And then adding in some more mud effect. This is the Deer Armour effects from Vallejo, and this is European mud. Not only adding a few different patches around the base itself, but also adding some to the bottom of the cloak. Now it's really those few finishing touches, so a few tufts here and there of varying colours around on the base. The tiniest small patch of flowers. Then a few dried leaves as well, before finishing with the obligatory black rim on the base. There we have one finished Merry miniature, and that really is how I would go about it for my own army. This is for a personal project. This is one of my own miniatures, and I just wanted to show you, especially if you've been watching the channel a little while, a little bit more how I would go about it in terms of order, and talk a little bit more about my processes using the wet palette, etc. I hope you found the video interesting and useful one way or another. That not everyone paints in this style, and I know that quite a few of you who watch my videos tend to stop at the base layer with the contrast, and I'm sure you can still copy some of that stage, but it wasn't laid out the way it normally would be, where I'd paint everything to that base layer and then move on and do all the highlights afterwards. I think this is a pretty nice hero stroke character standard for a gaming army. The final highlights and things still aren't quite refined enough for it to be display level, or for competition, definitely not. But it's a level I kind of like to paint to, and a level I can look at the miniatures and be happy with for them to be the characters in my army. And hopefully, while it doesn't differ an awful lot from a lot of the painting I do on the channel, by adding that sort of extra detail and explanation, hopefully it's given people a sort of some greater depth and insight. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you'd like to see more videos like this or less videos like this, let me know. Also, head over and join the Discord for the channel if you haven't already. It's a great place to chat painting if you like to talk painting, but also just talk about gaming in general. There's a number of free channels open to all people over on the Discord, and then if you are a Patreon member, you get access to a few more as well. Thank you again for watching. Hope you have a fantastic Christmas. A couple more videos planned in the week leading up to New Year. It's a video that's been available to patrons for a few days now. So that's just a little bit of a review and unboxing of Army Painter's Excel wet palette, which you'll have seen in this video. And then hopefully I'll have time to do one more, which will be on the weekend of the New Year. But I can't promise that just yet. It's fun at home with kids at Christmas. And sometimes that fun means not getting to go and paint toy soldiers and make videos. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. Merry Christmas, take care, and I'll catch you soon.